Buenos dias, Chicago. My name is René Morales. I'm the James W. Ellsdorf Chief Curator here at the Museum of Contemporary Art, Chicago. And I want to welcome you on behalf of the MCA to the inauguration of a very meaningful and innovative exhibition, Entre Horizontes, Art and Activism Between Chicago and Puerto Rico, which will be on view here until May 5th, 2024. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you also to our generous funders, a full list of whom you can see on this slide behind me. Before we begin, we would be grateful if you'd kindly turn off your cell phones, unless of course you're using them for captioning. To receive real-time captions in Spanish or English, please use the QR codes available here. So, a few words about the exhibition and about the day. Entre Horizontes, Art and Activism Between Chicago and Puerto Rico, examines the artistic lineages and social justice movements that connect Puerto Rico with Chicago. Featuring works by an intergenerational group of artists with ties to Chicago, the exhibition presents Puerto Rican painters who use techniques and approaches associated with printmaking, alongside artists who address social and political issues in their work. Entre Horizontes is part of the MCA's robust commitment to our local communities. The exhibition centers Chicago as a city that for decades has served as an important nexus for national conversations on Puerto Rican self-determination and issues pertinent to the broader Latino, Latina, and Latinx communities, such as immigration and bilingual education. In the weeks to come, we'll be announcing additional programs that have been designed in cooperation with members of the local diasporican community, including one that brings together the contributors to the reader that accompanies the show, which will launch in the spring. So stay tuned to our channels for more information. And come back again next week for Tuesdays on the Terrace, where we are presenting the Bomberos de Cora of La Escuelita Bombera de Corazón, who championed the historic and politically significant Puerto Rican music style known as bomba. I can almost hear it in my head. Today, we are immensely proud to present a full day of programming and performance in celebration of this opening. Immediately after this conversation, right here in this theater, the MCA is honored to present the world premiere screening of the new half-hour documentary Humboldt Park, Raíces de Resistencia, produced by Televisa and Univision Chicago. Afterward, please join us on the plaza at 1 p.m. for a choreographed performance, El agua era el cielo, the water was the sky, by Nibia Pastrana Santiago in collaboration with Eduardo F. Rosario. This 4-hour-long event takes its title from a 1957 poem by Juan Antonio Correger, Recreaciones Panorámicas, using movement and sound improvisation to reflect upon landscapes near and far, evoking a time and place where water was once the sky. The dialogue we're about to listen to is between Carla Acevedo-Yates, the Marilyn and Larry Fields curator here at the MCA and lead curator on Entre Horizontes, and Puerto Rican community activist and writer José y López. For over 40 years, el señor López has been a leading member of the Puerto Rican independence movement and also is the editor of Puerto Rican Nationalism, a reader. Among his many leadership initiatives in the community, he has served as the executive director of the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, Juan Antonio Correger, here in Chicago, which he co-founded in 1973. Together, Carla and Jose will speak on the past, present, and future of Puerto Rican activism. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the MCA stage Carla Acevedo-Yates and José López.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the MCA. I hope you're doing well. Thank you for joining us today. for this opening talk. I am absolutely thrilled and honored to share the stage with José López, a person that I deeply admire and that has inspired many parts of the exhibition. So thank you so much for joining me today. It's so great to see so many familiar faces today. I know some of you very well, so I'm just thrilled to have you here and for us to be in conversation together. This exhibition is very special to me also because it's something that I've been thinking about for many years, and it has a very special place within the history also of this institution. And I thought that maybe we can start this dialogue with the way we met, like the day we met. We were actually introduced by Jan Sussler, who is joining us today, who has become a dear friend of mine. And she was introduced in turn to me by Beatriz Santiago Muñoz, who's an artist that participates in the exhibition with the installation Safe House, which is at the center of the show. And that day that we met, we had lunch, and we had a jibarito sandwich. And you were telling me about the history of the sandwich, and I thought, what better way to start this conversation with the sandwich? Because we have such rich culinary history, right? And food for us is so important, and it captures so much of our culture and our identity. So can you talk a little bit about the history of this sandwich and how it really like captures Puerto Rican Chicago?
Well, before I do that, I would be remiss if I didn't express my deepest sense of gratitude on behalf of the entire Puerto Rican community of Chicago for the work that you have done. It is, on a personal level, extremely important to me. One of the most important pieces, I should say, from my perspective, not necessarily in the terms of the artwork, is obviously the work of Elisam Escobar that is there. And for it to be exhibited in this amazing museum, for it to be part of this amazing exhibit, obviously is extremely important to me and to us who participated in a whole struggle to free Elisam and all of the Puerto Rican political prisoners. So I really wanted to, obviously, express our gratitude and also to acknowledge how amazing Carla is. Carla is a great artist, a great intellect, but she's extremely, extremely humble. And I believe one of the greatest attributes of a human being is humility. So thank you, Carla.
Thank you.
So as everybody knows, I love history, and everything for me has to be placed in a historical context. So I told Carla that el jibarito is a sandwich that was invented here in Chicago by a Puerto Rican in Chicago, the owner of Borinquen Restaurant on then California and Wabansia. And he was from Jayuya. He obviously spent most of his life and his family's life here in Chicago. And he came up with this concept of, instead of serving a sandwich with bread, to serve it with a tostón. And that's exactly what a Puerto Rican jibarito is, right? And jibarito refers to the people of the interior of Puerto Rico, the peasants of Puerto Rico. So what better way to express that, particularly in terms of the food. So you should know that Puerto Rican food, I believe, is the best food in the world. It's the most syncretic expression of culture because it is obviously made with the ingredients from Africa, from the Americas, and from Europe. And that syncretism, the best way to express it is ultimately in our sofrito, but just to note that the plátanos themselves originate in Africa. And we're the only people in Latin America that call bananas guineos, referencing to the area where bananas come from in Western Africa, Guinea. So I think that I gave you some of that stuff, right?
Thank you. And thank you for those beautiful words. They really mean a lot to me. I mean, I'm just so floored and so grateful. These past couple of days have been incredible. That same day that we met, I was telling you that, I moved to Chicago in 2019 to take this job. But there was also another relationship to the city, and it's that my great uncle was recruited by a company, and he died in a work-related accident in a factory here in Illinois. And I had always heard the story when I was a little girl, told by my grandmother, and it was a total mystery what happened. She didn't even know what happened to her brother. So there's also that relationship to that history in Chicago, that it's a family relationship. And my family personally is from Barranquitas. That is a rural area. Barranquitas is a mountain town in the central range of Puerto Rico, for those who don't know. So we come from a rural area. My whole entire family comes from Barranquitas, both my mother and my father's side. And something that you were talking about is how different the migration of Puerto Ricans to Chicago is in relationship to the migration to New York. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that history.
Absolutely. The Puerto Rican migration to Chicago begins in the mid-40s, a little before, right after literally the Second World War. And a lot of Puerto Ricans were recruited during the war as well as after to work in the fields in the northeastern part of the United States. So they went to Connecticut to plant tobacco. They went to New York, upper New York, to plant tomatoes. They went to New Jersey to plant asparagus. But they were treated almost in slave-like conditions. Their ticket was paid. Now they were indebted to those to the farm owner, and then they continued to be indebted because they needed to buy everything from the company store. They were not allowed to bring their family. They lived in barracks. And finally, a lot of them began to move and to escape, literally, and follow, in a way, the westward migration for cities, to cities that were primarily producing steel. So you get, obviously, the migration from Bethlehem, Allentown, Pittsburgh, and then, obviously, into Lorain, Ohio, Cleveland, and then Chicago. So one of the first migrations to Chicago is that of the migration of the steel mills. But then these were rural people who then began to bring their families directly to Chicago. So the Puerto Rican experience in Chicago has no urban experience. In New York, you move from the rural areas to the shanty towns of San Juan or Ponce, and then obviously to New York. That experience Puerto Ricans did not have in Chicago. You came from the small towns directly to this, obviously, this urban city.
How do you think that difference has shaped the community here? Because I feel like it's very distinctive. And part of what the show is trying to do is really center Chicago as the epicenter of Puerto Rican activism and self-determination, because we always hear about New York, we hear about, even in the story of the Young Lords, we hear it's about New York, right? And through the process, we learned that actually the Young Lords started here in Chicago. So it's like trying to recenter Chicago in this conversation, both in the social justice movements, but also artistically. How has this particular difference in migration shaped the communities here?
Well, I think one of the things that's really important is to think about rural Puerto Rico. Most Puerto Ricans don't really identify that much with their towns as they do with their barrios. The barrios have a very important role in Puerto Rican history. They really were the centers in the 16th, 17th, 18th century in the rural areas. That's what defined a community. And so, and one of the things that, every rural house in Puerto Rico has is the batey. The batey's antecedent are the ceremonial courtyard of the Taíno Indians. So it was a place to celebrate the arreto. But I want to make sure that we understand that there's a deep sense of community already, and this migration, a lot of the people came, and obviously they didn't all come from the same barrio, they came from the same town. You organize yourself around that town. So in Chicago in the 1950s, you would have barber shops. Even today, you have Luquillo and Jayuya. You can go, and before, the bodegas were all of every town in Puerto Rico. And on weekends, those bodegas became the center of life in exchange of information, etc. So there was sort of the rural experience, I think, creates a sense of community or maintains a sense of community, which is deeper than having passed through an urban experience in Puerto Rico.
I want to shift a little bit to your personal story, the migration of your family. I know you came to Chicago when you were 9 years old. Can you talk a little bit about that experience?
Like most Puerto Ricans, I came from the barrio in San Sebastián, Ay Bonito, and we came here in 1959. For me, the important thing about that experience is that we came to live literally on Division Street, which was then called La Division. Most Puerto Ricans here created areas, and it was really known by the street, La Clark. So you went around and named the community after the street. So we came to live in very close to Division. Later on, we lived on Division Street. And the experience was one in which I tell my grandchildren and my great-granddaughter that I have lived 3 centuries in one. I lived the rural experience of 19th century Puerto Rico without electricity, without running water, with none of the amenities that we may think of modern life, right? And in one day, I changed from that experience to the experience of a full 20th century urban experience, where you had electricity, where you had running water, where you had all these amenities. So, and obviously now I'm in the 21st century, so we've lived 3 centuries in one. But what that did to me was to come here, live in extremely marginalized conditions. So much so that I came here when I was in 3rd grade in Puerto Rico. I was immediately demoted to 2nd grade. All Puerto Ricans who came to Chicago were immediately demoted. Then you were not sent to just 2nd grade. That time they would have 2A, 2B, 2C. All Puerto Ricans were placed in 2C, which was obviously the worst. And then you were in this room, but then you couldn't stay in the classroom. You were sent to the coat room, and there they would have a big table where all the Puerto Rican kids were placed because we were a disturbance to the class because we couldn't speak English. So we were isolated completely. Imagine being in a coat room, and you can talk to a lot of Puerto Ricans my age who went through that experience, having to use the bathroom, and you couldn't because you had to wait till the teacher came there, and that's when she decided to come into the coat room. So we were totally marginalized. So much so that in 1969-70, obviously I went to Loyola University, and I had graduated from Tully High School, which at that time had the largest number of Puerto Rican students. It was an inner city school built for 1,500 students, and there were 3,000 students in that school. I mean, horrible conditions. I graduated from there, went to Loyola, and then I was selected to serve as a research assistant for the first study on Puerto Rican students in Chicago. It's a study that was done by Dr. Isidro Lucas, a Spanish sociologist, entitled Puerto Rican Dropouts, Numbers, and Motivation. We concluded 72.9% of the Puerto Rican students who entered the Chicago public high schools dropped out. But we also concluded and heard a very important theme from these young people, which teachers hear me, they don't listen to me. So I decided that I wanted to go into teaching. I came back to teach at Tully High School, and obviously it was a momentous occasion because I was back into my school. Many of my students who had been literally, they were freshmen when I left. Now they were seniors. And I, right after that, that experience led us to create our alternative high school. But the idea was that day I got to go to the teacher's lounge. And I was able, this is a space I had never been able to enter. And in that space, I experienced something that was my wake-up call. And that was a sofa at inside of the lounge, in the teacher's lounge, and my ex-English teacher, a nice white lady, basically was sleeping and had written a sign on herself which read, "Do not disturb Puerto Ricans at work." Now, that was my wake-up call, because this woman had never demonstrated any sense of being a racist, but she was making a total racist observation to her colleagues. And so it was my wake-up call, because I had to deal with the fact that I'm a light-skinned Puerto Rican, that I'm a nerdy Puerto Rican kid, and I became the exceptional Puerto Rican. And that was my wake-up call, never to be the exceptional Puerto Rican. And I tell my African-American students, my Mexican students, never be the exceptional, because if you are, you have bought and you have drunk the Kool-Aid. And so at that moment, I had to make a decision that was informed also by my brother's practice, Oscar López Rivera, who was a political prisoner, spent 36 years in U.S. prisons, along with Elisam, and with a charge of seditious conspiracy, the same charge that was given to Nelson Mandela, and now they're using against these insurrectionists of January 6th. But what is important here is that my brother came out of Vietnam in 67, but in 1966, there would be an amazing uprising on Division Street. It was called the Division Street Riots. People have called it all kinds using the word riot. It was not a riot. It was a rebellion. It was a conscious attempt to claim our place in this city and say, we had helped to build this city. We were part of this city, and we wanted to be treated as citizens. And it was 2.5 days. Nowhere in the United States has there ever been a Puerto Rican uprising that extensive and intensive. But 11 years later, there would be another one in 1977 addressing the same conditions. And what I think is important in order to give this sort of, I believe, that the background to this exhibit, to the Puerto Rican experience, is that we have to understand the Puerto Rican experience in the United States as an experience of an internal colonized people. Structural racism has a name, and it's colonialism. Modern racism was used to justify colonialism starting 500 years ago. And so there have been different types of colonial experiences. We do not live in a post-colonial world. We live in a colonial world. And that is important because a great deal of humanity in many parts of the world are internal colonies. The indigenous people of most of Latin America are still internal colonies. The indigenous people here in the United States are internal colonies. The native Hawaiians constitute an internal colony. You could just see it with the situation in Maui. And so, when we look at our situation, that's the way we have to see it. And we have to see the Puerto Rican migration within that context of a migration in which we change place, but not condition. We move from an external colonial reality to an internal colonial reality, sharing our experience, horrible colonial experience, with our African American brothers and sisters, with our indigenous brothers and sisters, with our Chicano brothers and sisters, and all the internal colonies in the United States. That's the way I view the Puerto Rican struggle. That's the way I view the Puerto Rican presence in Chicago. And so for me, I think that's the way to contextualize a little bit of the exhibit.
No, thank you so much, Jose. Always so inspiring to learn from you. And one of the things we discussed that day, again, when we met, and we've had several conversations, is about Maroon culture. And I've been like fascinated by that history because it's a way of surviving, right? To have a foot in and a foot outside. And how do we build communities? We build exhibition programs. How do we function within these systems, within these structures? Can you talk a little bit about the legacy of Maroon culture and how we carry that legacy in our work?
So the word maroon comes from the Spanish cimarrón, which was reference to wild pigs. The Spaniards began to call cimarrones the people who fled from their colonial enterprise. The first people to flee were the native people. And most people see cimarrón societies and maroon societies within the context of runaway slaves. Yes, most of them were of runaway slaves, but there were also runaway native people, runaway Europeans who had come from the Iberian Peninsula, like the Sephardic Jews, like the Moorish people who are African people, who were Muslims. All these people sought refuge when they came from the colonial enterprise by going to the mountains. The first expression of a maroon society is actually between Haiti, the mountains between today Haiti and the Dominican Republic, led by a woman named Ana Caona. In Puerto Rico, she's been immortalized by Tite Curet in that song, Ana Caona. But if you go to Haiti, she is a Loa. She is one of the great founders of Haitian identity. And so here is a native woman who began this process of creating communities of resistance pretty much alongside the colonial enterprise. And I think that's important because when we think about social justice anywhere in terms of our communities, we have to see it from the perspective that we ourselves, as Eduardo Rocho tries to remind me, the Irish Sinn Féin, we ourselves alone have to do our own liberation. And so what happened in the Maroon societies was that you created parallel institutions, but you also created a practice of freedom. So alongside a colonial enterprise, you would have the practice of freedom. And how do we know that? Well, all you have to do is study the samba in Brazil, the tango in Argentina, the merengue in the Dominican Republic, the guaracha in Cuba, the bomba en plena, and even the salsa in Puerto Rico, the sones of Mexico, and the cumbia of Colombia. And what do you find in all of them? The sounds and rhythms of Africa. And even in rock and roll, right? In other words, African people brought here in these maroon societies perpetuated their historical memory. But they were not just African. If you study the bomba in Puerto Rico, you use a whole series of instruments that are not African. They're indigenous. So here we have this creation, this incredible creativity expressed in our music across the Americas that are really speak to that idea of resistance in those areas, but also to the creation of new cultural identities. And who we are as Puerto Ricans, who we are as Mexicans, who we are as Colombian, Cuban, Dominican, we are the products of maroon societies. So when we began to create the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, if you go on Division Street, on Paseo Boricua, you see all these places that have the Puerto Rican Cultural Center. And people think, wow, these people must have a lot of money and they have a lot of spaces. No, we did this purposely. We decentralized our structure. We decentralized in such a way that people understood, I go here and I know that one of my needs is met, but I'm also part. There's an intersectionality in all of our work. And that's how that's how maroon societies lived and practiced. So it's that history that I think in our own practice, but also in our own content, because the Cultural Center is driven by three principles: self-determination, self-actualization, and self-reliance, which are the decolonizing principles that our forebears in the maroon societies spoke to us about.
And that same day you told me, and I remember because I was revising the notes this morning of our conversation that day, and you said, Latino is not an identity, it's a political mission. Yes. And that is so inspiring to me, to my own work. So can you talk a little bit about how can we shift that mentality to not have like this kind of fixed identity, but have it be a political mission built on solidarity, which Absolutely. I think that's something that you've discussed a lot, especially with the Mexican community here in Chicago.
Absolutely. First and foremost, I want to tell everybody, and particularly people who think they know the Latino and Latina experience here, that the concept of Latinidad is birthed in Chicago as a political practice. If you lived in Los Angeles in the 1960s, if you were Spanish speaking, you were Mexican. If you lived in New York, you were Spanish speaking, you were Puerto Rican. If you lived in Miami and you were Spanish speaking, you were Cuban. In the 60s and 70s, large numbers or similar numbers of Puerto Ricans, Mexicans, Cubans, Central Americans, other Caribbean people, particularly Dominicans, came to Chicago. And we had no alternative but to create that political practice called Latinidad. Right now, we're in the year 2023. In 1973, a group of young Mexicans and Puerto Ricans, including students of Pedro Albizu Campos were arrested at the University of Illinois. We took over the chancellor's office, and from that practice, we created a Latino Latin American Studies program, a Latino Recruitment de Lares program, and a Latino Cultural Center. That is what we're talking about. How do you impact as a political project on the greater society? But how do you respect and maintain your identity? Because we are who we are, and we should not give that up. I'm Puerto Rican, and I'm proud of it. And I have a political mission which is informed by Latinidad. But let me tell you, this is not new. This began with the resistance of the Maroon societies. If you study Maroon societies across the Americas, what you would find is that people in Haiti were actually in conversations with people in Trinidad, Tobago. They were in conversation with people in Puerto Rico. They were in conversation with Jamaica, Cuba, all over, including Latin America. As a matter of fact, Simón Bolívar would have never been able to be successful in liberating Northern South America without the support of the Haitian people and the Haitian Revolution. All right? Simón Bolívar went into exile in Haiti. Okay? As a matter of fact, Simón Bolívar would land with a whole bunch of ships that were filled with weapons in 1816 on the island of Vieques, Puerto Rico, because there was a hurricane. So he stopped in Puerto Rico. And there he writes a letter, which is very famous, called A Letter to a Jamaican Gentleman. And he proposes the creation of the Confederation of the Antilles. Think about it. So our unity is deeply rooted in a historical practice. Most people may not know, but several Puerto Ricans fought for the independence of Mexico. All right? They fought in Nicaragua, in Venezuela, and Colombia, alongside Simón Bolívar. And so did Cubans. We got to learn our history a little bit better. And if we do that, I think the Latinos in the United States have a political task, and that is the task to liberate this entire continent. We're living in 2023, as I said earlier. In 1823, 200 years ago, the U.S. issued a doctrine called the Monroe Doctrine, which is still in practice to this day, that declared Latin America is our backyard. And we must ultimately act collectively to say Latin America is not the backyard of the United States, and we should not be the open veins for the United States to continue to be rich. And I'm going to say something even a little bit more radical, because José Martí taught us a wonderful lesson. José Martí, there's a beautiful quote from José Martí which says, I have lived inside the entrails of the monster, and I know its ways. Mine is the slingshot of David. Think about that in relationship to Latinos in the United States. By the end of the century, 1 out of every 4 people living in the United States will be Latinos.
Jose, that's incredible. So where do we go from here? I mean, that's the question. How are we achieving this, that's the question, right? How do we create these networks of solidarity amongst Latinos? Because what they want is to divide and conquer, right? That's the colonial tool. So how do we start creating those networks? How have you created them through your work, through the Puerto Rican Cultural Center, which I know collaborates with other organizations, so it's not just about Puerto Rican communities. Talk a little bit about how you've been doing your work in that regard.
I could start listing our relationship going back to the Panthers here, but also to movements in the United States like the Republic of New Africa with the Malcolm X grassroots movements. I mean, I could spend a lot of time talking about this, but I think for me, something very important that happened last year, 2 years ago, we were able to introduce into the legislature of the state of Illinois a concept that it's literally a policy goal. Every state legislature in the United States can create special service district or special districts, historical, economic, all kinds of things. No state has created a cultural enterprise district. Illinois, just last year, the governor signed into law the creation of cultural enterprise districts. What does that mean? It means that there are certain areas in this country and in the state and in the city that people have laid claim to. And laid claim to areas, in the case of the Puerto Ricans and African Americans, there were literally, and Mexicans, literally slums. And so, we came up with this idea of creating cultural enterprise district. And in Illinois, within the next few years, there will be six cultural enterprise districts where culture defines everything, including as an enterprise, which means that it's an economic engine as well, which means that the state of Illinois has to invest in these communities. So communities that have been historically disinvested and that face the tremendous challenge of gentrification can obviously survive. And they can survive by upholding their identities, by being places of cultural activity, by being able to have places that people can live in many ways similar to the maroon societies and yet be welcoming to everyone. And if we did that, I think one of the things that we're going to be able to create is not the homogenized city that we're creating in Chicago. Look at those nasty looking condos that you're building, okay? I want you to visit Paseo Boricua and see some of the buildings. We just built an amazing building designed by an amazing Puerto Rican woman architect, created the Paseo Boricua, the Nancy Franco Maldonado Paseo Boricua Arts Building. And I want you to see that. It's a building for artists to live, work, and produce their art. And it will house the Urban Theater Company, the only Puerto Rican folks Latino theater company in Chicago. And I can tell you that if we did that, we would be creating the world in the city. Think about how great that is. That we could create sort of this magical urbanism that speaks to something which is taught to us in the Quran, the holy book of Islam. And that is, there's a quote from the Quran that says, "We have made you different so you can know each other. Our very humanity is premised on our differences. And this is one way for us to begin to really recreate the United States from within. So, and that's extremely important because there's a wonderful African-American scholar by the name of Dr. Mindy Thompson Fulilove. She wrote a wonderful book called Root Shock. And her thesis is that the black community in the United States is in a state of root shock. Well, the body goes into shock when it meets, obviously, when it confronts trauma. And she's saying the black communities in the United States have been literally, black cultural production has been stymied because of the practice of urban renewal and gentrification. The greatest moments of black America were the black metropolis all over this country, including Bronzeville in Chicago. And those, most of them have been bulldozed. And in bulldozing, you have destroyed African American cultural production. We must be able to address this within a new vision of the kind of city we want to create and the kind of solidarity which we must have.
I can't even imagine a better way to end this conversation with the thought of solidarity, right? Which undergirds all of your work. I learn so much from you every single time you speak, so thank you so much. You are such an inspiring figure to me and to so many of us. Thank you for joining me today in this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us. Please give a round of applause to José López, please.
And to Carla. she really should be the star of this whole process. Thank you, Carla.
Thank you, José. Thank you so much.